Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we're going to look into how the creation of the State of Israel caused a refugee problem in the Middle East, and how that system is still in place today. Let's get started. After a recent podcast discussing issues in Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, and the history of the area, there were many questions asked or requests to discuss the issue of the refugee situation in the Middle East. For more background information on this, please check out our earlier episode on the Israeli apartheid fraud. The Middle East refugee crisis began in the 1940s. About 850,000 refugees gathered their belongings to leave their homes, businesses, and communities behind. Their families had lived in the area for hundreds or even thousands of years, some even dating back to the 6th century before the Common Era. They were not leaving due to their desire to emigrate or because they were being welcomed by another country, but leaving due to discrimination and physical risk by the local populations. Some of the refugees' bank accounts were frozen, others were imprisoned, some were banished and dispossessed by the local governments. Sadly, even some were killed in bombings. Some modern estimates suggest the refugees left behind about 40,000 square miles of land and assets worth approximately $250 billion today. This is the tragic story of the Mizrahi Jews, Jewish families who were living in the Arab and North African land since the time of the Bible. These families left everything behind in the face of increasing discrimination by countries that they had lived in for years. At the United Nations in 1947, Arab leaders warned what Jews in their countries would face if a Jewish state was declared in the British Mandate for Palestine. On the eve of the UN partition plan vote, the Iraqi foreign minister Fadil Jamali warned that, quote, masses in the Arab world cannot be restrained. The Arab-Jewish relations in the Arab countries will greatly deteriorate, and he was right. In 1947 and 1948 in Syria, anti-Jewish pogroms erupted in Aleppo, and the government froze all Jewish bank accounts. In Egypt, bombs were detonated in the Jewish quarter, killing dozens. In Algeria, anti-Jewish decrees were swiftly instituted, and in Yemen, bloody pogroms led to the death of nearly 100 Jews. In January 1948, the president of the World Jewish Congress appealed to the U.S. Secretary of State, saying that, quote, between 800,000 and 1 million Jews in the Middle East and North Africa, exclusive of Palestine, are in the greatest danger of destruction. Acts of violence already perpetrated, together with those contemplated, being clearly aimed at the total destruction of the Jews, constitutes a genocide, which under resolution of the General Assembly is a crime against humanity. Through a combination of persecution and mob violence, more than 99% of the region's Jews fled that region by the 1970s. So where did these Mizrahi Jews go? They became refugees and fled to the only place in the world that would take them, a brand new state of Israel. Upon their arrival in Israel, these Jewish immigrants who were forced to leave their homes overcame personal and communal tragedy, and they did not only persevere, but they thrived. As the majority left their property behind in their home countries to journey to Israel, many suffered from severe disease, and their socioeconomic status was affected by their cultural and political differences from those Israelis who had been in Palestine for generations. The incredibly new and fragile state of Israel took the burden of housing and providing social services for all of the refugees who came from across the world, having to assimilate, rehome, and support these people who had lost everything. Israel felt that it was their duty to take in these Jewish refugees facing hate and violence. Following the Holocaust, the country knew that it had a responsibility to protect Jews from future persecutions across the globe. This was officially later codified into Israeli law in the 1950s, in a law called the Law of Return. This law grants all Jews the right to seek refuge in Israel for safety. Mizrahi immigrants and refugees were placed in rudimentary and hastily erected tent cities, often in the developed towns or peripheries of Israel. Settlements in the Moshavim, or cooperative farming villages, were only partially successful because the Mizrahim had historically worked as craftsmen and merchants, and most did not traditionally engage in farm work. These settlements were eventually removed and dismantled as the refugees became successful Israeli citizens. They re-established businesses and obtained jobs in the new Israeli state. The Jewish Arab refugee story was a great success. Many rose to important positions in the national government and in public and private sectors. Many have made invaluable contributions to the fabric of the Israeli society. When we come back, we will discuss the more heavily referenced and more documented refugee crisis, the Palestinian refugees, when we return on the Jewish Diaspora Report.